There we go. Let me sit up straight, and welcome everyone to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, Griffin Verro, joined by our editor Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, and our good friends and GMs, Red Rabbit and Lessons Learned. When it comes to tabletop games, I have 15 years of experience writing, playing, and fixing problematic rules to the table. Pronouns are he, him, they, them. Lessons.
Yes, I'm Lessons Learned 1 here on Twitch and Lessons Learned over at YouTube. I also writer over at Amazon when Night and Stars, my speculative fiction collection. I have been playing over 20 years of all kinds of amazing and dreadful games, and I've extracted painful and wonderful lessons from each one of them. Did I learn them well? We're about to find out.
And Rafferty.
Hello world, I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him, Sanguine Games, all that jazz. I have been gaming for at least 30 years and I'm slowly turning to dust before your very eyes.
Oh. And of course, last but not least, Red.
Hi, Red Rabbit here, running our Ironclad game on Wednesday mornings on the channel. Come check it out also. Playing in games of Vampire 5th Edition and Forbidden Lands, my new fave. And yeah, I'm a student of narrative and game design.
Excellent. So, for today's topic, when it comes to playing games, there's a lot of ways to handle information between players. In games like chess, you have perfect information on the board, but if you're playing a game like poker, you don't know what's in someone else's hands. Tabletop RPGs are in a curious state where players are both highly informed about the situation and very uninformed simultaneously until the host conveys that information. And sometimes that information can also come with caveats like, you don't think there are any traps. So today we'll be going over how perception and information work in RPGs. So, who sees the problem right here first?
My roll is terrible. Yeah, there you go. Right. Perception is how it's the first step in interacting with a fantasy world, right? You are expressing what's going on to the players. The implication that you're giving imperfect information is kind of taken as granted, right, in many cases. But solving that issue with a skill check means that a lot of players default to it. It becomes a rote action that feels like it starts to replace creative interaction within your world space. By that I mean, I describe that there's a room with a painting on the wall, a rug on the floor, and a desk in the corner. And then you say, I roll for perception. Exactly. I roll perception. Where are all the traps? Like, where are all the things in this room that matter to me now? That's something that has been a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm with you on that.
I think it's, especially because I'm the kind of player, GM that is like to do a little bit of a mystery in the sort of try to feed information to my players, being fair to them, while not giving everything away in one go has been a challenge for me. Or sometimes I'm just tired. I'm like, yeah, there's no traps, or whatever. Let's move on, whatever. And it's like players like, hey, are you awake? Come on, please. We need this info, right? Please be clear and enunciate your words and give us information that is useful to us. The other problem is sometimes that you just say something off the cuff. It's like, yeah, no, there is a painting on the wall. It's like, there's a painting on the wall. And all the players go, oh no, there's a painting on the wall. And you're like, it's just a painting. And the more you try to tell them, it's just a painting. It just
when the players get fixated on something. Yeah. And there's a problem with that because that gets into performative role play. Because like the idea of improv being that we build up, because we already said be fair, build up, and have fun. That if someone becomes enamored of a certain aspect of the story, they're going to want to build upon it because it's interesting to them. And the idea, we're getting into the conflict of, well, is this a simulation where I wrote down what everything is and everything was already set up before you got here? Or is this a story where I'm making stuff up as we go along and I'm only like stuff that's interesting gets coverage in the story and developed and built upon, and stuff that we're not paying any attention to, we don't bother with, because that's a huge problem.
But here's the thing about presentation too, where as the GM, you're the source of everyone's information usually, and it's your choice whether you're going to give positive information. There are bookshelves with books that are green, blue, and red, or negative and say, there's nothing interesting on the bookshelf.
Well, you don't necessarily get a choice because, once again, Rapper's your whipping boy. Dungeons and Dragons, the newer editions, are very specific that only rogues are able to like locate or disarm a trap. Although 5th edition, did they change that? Anyone can disarm a trap. It's just people.
Anybody has thief tools. Anybody who has the skill with thief tools can do it.
What if you don't have the proficiency of these tools?
Then you can't.
Can you still detect them?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
I think you still get a bonus for being a rogue, though.
You do, because you get the proficiency bonus. So it was recently pointed out to me there's no skills in D&D 5. There are proficiencies and ability checks, but there aren't no skills.
There's no skill checks, they're ability checks.
They're called ability checks, which I thought was fun. Moving on from the pedantry.
Yeah.
I mean, and also I really think it's exacerbated because some D&D adventures, especially the old school ones, are contests in ludicrousness of how to build the most incomprehensible trap. I mean, what does a glyph of warding look like? It's a trap. You all know what a glyph of warding is, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, it's where there's some sort of weird symbol up on a doorway, and you go, huh, that's weird, and I bet it's not important, and you go in, and then it goes off.
I mean, anything can be trapped. There's that stupid joke of, I memorized exploding runes today. Yes, merely reading something could kill you. And so...
Glyph of Warding has several different triggers, and the funniest one of them that it says in Pathfinder version of it is, if you look at it and try to figure out what it is, it goes off.
That's great.
But if you
That's
just
really good.
ignore it, nothing happens.
Quick, get the dyslexic in the front.
Which
All right,
is,
that's my last ableist joke for the day.
which is
Okay.
the worst way to have something happen.
Well, that's definitely punitive for people who,
It's punitive for being
That's
curious.
hilarious. The mere act of
punish the
trying to
player.
interpret your environment kills you.
Yeah, well, it's
but I
for
wanna
the
go
player
back
who
to-
says, like, wait, I just am looking at the trap, I'm not interacting with it. And then the GM can say, well, looking at it is enough. That counts in the state of Alabama.
It's a quantum trap that changes the condition whether you're observing it or not.
Yeah, quantum
but
trap, exactly.
Yeah.
And
But I want to go.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I want to go back to the same story because if you're adding elements to add sort of a atmosphere, right? For example, you want to say that there's a painting, a very gaudy painting, right? Because the person who lives here has no taste, and it becomes like, oh no, this becomes highlighted in my video game scan system that has a shining or whatever, so it must be important, right? Because I think that might be one of the things that video saying that because of signal posting, and this is basically what it is when it comes to perception, is players are visually told what's important because they have sparkles or because, there's some symbology or it turns blue if you hit a tap button or whatever. So it's like I walk into a room, like if you play all those 2.5D games from BioWare and other games, they basically just have, okay, click tab and whatever is important will highlight.
Well, see, I can build on that too, because often there's a problem with perception being what do we see, but it can also be what we don't see. Because building on your video game metaphor, when you're playing Mass Effect and you go around the corner and the room is suddenly huge, but filled with a conspicuous amount of barricades and chest-high walls, you don't see anybody, but you know shit's about to go down.
Yes.
So, and that's a huge problem in a lot of these games because they'll say, well, you didn't see the 50 ogres. But it was like, couldn't you at least tell us it was an ambush spot?
Yeah. I mean, so can I go back to my initial setup and expand on it a little bit? So, because in my mind, the way I would like to have the room with the painting and the rug and the desk play out is I would love to have people interact with the room, right? I would love it if my players said, oh, I want to go up to the painting. Oh, people like to hide trapdoors. I'd like to check under the rug. Does the desk have drawers in it? I'd like to open them. Are they locked? Like, the thing is that I feel like there's an aspect of role-playing that has been supplanted by rolling dice and making ability checks, because skill checks aren't a thing. Players have this expectation that every problem in the world is solvable based on something that's written on their character sheet. Whereas it's kind of refreshing. I mean, this is something Forbidden Lands says. Forbidden Lands doesn't have a perception skill per se. They have a skill called scouting used in certain circumstances. But they say, when you're in a room, you describe the room. The characters tell you what they do. if they interact with a trapped object, that trap goes off. But they don't just stand at the door and roll perception, and then you tell them the
I
stuff
kind
they
of want
miss.
to take the devil's advocate on this as somebody who has played old school gaming. Whereas when you're not like the player, we just did our minimaxing talk, and the play like I've met a lot of players who, when you ask them what they want to do, they'll pause and look at their character sheet because their character sheet will help tell them what they want to do. Because what can I do? Well, in the real world, I can do anything. What does the game say I can do? And often they'll ask to make those rolls because if you're playing an old school game, you'll run into the GMs who say, you didn't say you were not stepping on cracks on the floor.
I suppose it's a stylistic thing.
Right. Well,
but
this
that is
like even in the 80s, they were making jokes of the 10-foot pole that shows up in all the inventory lists was you're poking the walls in front of you constantly and communicating to each other in sign language to not alert monsters of your presence. Because if you didn't say, you observe something, and that's a huge problem because the computer games have that edge on us. Because like Lessons was talking about, if I want to do a puzzle, like there's a D&D published adventure, official adventure, where solving the puzzle is that the floor is a chessboard. So you would have to put a chessboard in front of players, and they would have to know what chess moves are, and you would have to specifically show them where they're standing when they took damage. You didn't get all of this information to them, and they didn't know what the hell you were talking about. They'll just be taking damage for no reason. Right. And they won't understand it. And so what might be a puzzle that all the speedrunners and Twitch streamers are complaining about instead would turn into it like a real tedious. So in the interest of being a little more proactive about this, I just we off to the press. Our Abyss game just went off to the presses, and Abyss is powered by the Apocalypse. And Powered by the Apocalypse has an interesting way of handling perception. I want to call it reading a situation or read the sitch. And the way they've got that worded is you don't make a roll and then the GM tells you a bunch of stuff. You make a roll and then you're allowed to ask questions about the situation. And they give you specific questions that you can ask. What's not here that should be here? What's the hidden danger? Who should I be talking to? Who are my enemies? Questions that players are going to ask you anyway. And at first I was kind of down on this because I thought, shouldn't you be giving this information out anyway? Like if I walk in the room, you should tell me there's 50 ogres here. Like open with that. And perception should be for hidden details. But building on a little further, Powered by the Apocalypse gives you a bonus to deal with whatever you ask about. So it could be that I will tell you there's 50 ogres in the room, but if you ask me, what should be my primary concern in the room? And I say, well, probably the 50 ogres. I mean, I would open with that. You get a bonus to deal with that. And I would probably break it down saying, well, you're probably more worried about the crossbowmen because they have range. But then since you get a bonus to deal with it, now we've flipped it around a little bit to where, yes, the player is doing something mechanical, but they're not doing it by rote, which was Red's big issue of, I rolled a 25, tell me everything. Instead, it's, I get to ask 3 questions. What, as a player, do I care about that I want to ask questions about? Because I'm going to get bonuses to deal with those things.
Right,
so if it's stuff
pointed questions that will actually advance what the game is about.
Well, advance, and we developed on that further because the read a sitch move is generic in Powered by the Apocalypse, but in Abyss, we made each of the sitch moves specific to the character that you're playing. So if you're playing a detective, you get to ask questions of what's here that isn't here, what crimes have been committed here, what is evidence. Whereas what I would thought was pretty cool when the playtesting came out was the ogre character. Like, okay, so we got the big dumb brute. All you do is smash things. They're not normally known for their perception, but we could give them questions they could ask, such as, how could I cause property damage here to my own advantage? Which was an interesting way to word the observation skill. It's like, now as the game master, so if the ogre and the detective walk in the room and they both make perception rolls, they're going to ask different questions. The detective's going to ask about crime, and the ogre's going to ask, is there anything I can push over on top of people, or any walls I can smash if I need to get out of here in a hurry? They're already going to be looking at the world in character. And to me, that immediately opened up what I thought was the big issue that Red was having, which was the idea that players show up and are passive about it. They're using the die to hammer on solutions. Whereas now, I guess the players still kind of are using it to hammer on solutions, but at least they're asking me stuff in character. They're rewarded for looking at the situation to deal with problems that they would deal with. And because we limit the number of questions you can ask based on your role, there's like 5 or 6 questions. You only get to ask 1 or 2. The player puts, they can either just ask every time about the property damage, or they can at least put some choice into it. But now we're in a better interactive situation. And I just want to say, I thought that was pretty cool. I thought it was a cool idea in BBTA, and I'm glad
I'm going to have to write that down.
Yeah,
Give extra information.
That's a good one. Yeah. I got a question for Griff.
You already see it kind of in D&D, because wizards will go in the room and they'll immediately say, what in here is magic? They'll immediately start asking that because they're in character. And the thieves will immediately start asking, what traps are here? And one of the problems you're running into is that's what they would ask. I mean, you almost want to do what Red would do and just tell them what's there because of it, like having something hidden. But I guess the last thing I would say is PBTA is pretty good about using carrots instead of sticks. Because normally you're telling a player, if I didn't see it, then it ambushes me, which is the huge problem with D&D, especially. It's like ambush and surprise are incredibly deadly in D&D. Things can kill you instantly, and things that attack from surprise are always deadlier for some reason. They're always like, you didn't see it coming, you're automatically hit.
Oh, I'm going to put a pin in that to complain about here in a minute. But
Right,
Brett,
so
you had a question, I think.
Yeah.
I did. It's
Let's
jump into another side of the perception conversation, but I wanted to pose a situation to you. You posed a situation to me last time.
All
So
right.
the situation is that you come up to a chest that is got treasure in it. Supposedly, it's locked. You approach it and you tell me that you want to check for traps. And I say, okay, roll me an investigation. And you roll a 2. And I say, there's no traps on this chest. What do you do?
Right.
You don't say that.
I have 2 different sources of information. One is what you said, and one is I have an empirical result that says I got you.
And I got to stop you right there. You, as the GM, you are doing this wrong. You don't say there are no traps on this chest. You say you didn't find any traps. Lessons is with me on this, because that's what happened. If you say there are no traps in this chest and I open it and the bomb goes off, you have lied to me as a game master. And I always have to emphasize this. While you may be allowed to cheat as a game master and bend the rules, you can't lie to players. You can't tell them something false. Because
I would still say both statements do still fall under negative information. I didn't learn anything positively about this.
Oh, you did learn. You learned you roll like ass. You loser.
Well, that's the point.
Right.
Like that's
I mean,
I got an investigation. I got back. There's a weird wire on the side, and it has some weird glyphs on the back of it, but nothing seems to be happening right now.
Well,
I'd still remain suspicious, but I could ask further questions about it.
See, but I want to roll this back a little bit because we're getting too much on that.
If I can, I want to build on this real quick. So the problem is, here, is that you're getting incomplete information. Like I know I rolled a 2, so I know that if there is a trap, I didn't find it, and that's what I would say is Rafferty. Well, if there is a trap, I didn't find it, and that's like an engineering question. Like you guys ever hang out with engineers?
yes.
Yes.
Okay, ask an engineer. Hey, if I flip the switch, will the machine come on? No engineer in the world will say yes.
Yeah.
The signs point to it, or the specs say it. They'll find some way to weasel out of giving you a yes or no answer.
Will the program finish if I run it? That's your question right there.
Yeah, last time just fine. It ran on my rig. All this, they will never give you a yes or no answer, and like that's one of the. So what we're running into the problem here of there's this mental disconnect here where people in real life like don't look at something and usually say, well, if it is here, I didn't find it, or they don't look at a room and say, I'm feeling off today. Yeah, they don't make random rolls and say, I'm feeling off today. I don't think I looked at the room as hard as I could.
Exactly.
That's where I want to pick up and say, so if I roll that 2, do I just say, well, I stopped searching?
Well,
I've
had characters. Yeah,
I looked at it and I didn't see anything immediately, so I'm done with it.
And to be fair, this is pretty funny, but I have had circumstances, and they were kind of tongue in cheek, where a player has rolled like a 1 on their trap investigation and said, okay, I'm not opening that. Anybody else want this chest? And yeah, that it's funny because the mechanics of the game are giving the player information that the character in the narrative would would not have.
Right, I think your issue here is that if someone checked for traps and didn't find any, they wouldn't
Presumably.
be looking at the one that they rolled and saying, well,
Yeah.
it came up one, so I didn't find anything. So you'd have to have two ways of dealing with this. One is you'd have to have the GM roll in secret, which, once again, is
Players
fascinating. Yeah, which players hate that. And in fact, games like Powered by the Apocalypse don't even permit that. Mm-hmm. So I think the problem here is like the way the mechanic is worded, because the mechanic is worded in such a way that you roll to detect, then you roll to disarm, and then you open the chest. It's 3 different steps. And the issue I have with that is it shouldn't be 3 different steps. It should be the mere act of opening the chest. If you say, I'm going to open this chest and disable the traps while I do it and make one roll to do the whole thing. Because the problem here is if you roll to detect and then roll to disarm, if you roll low on the roll to detect, you're too paranoid and have to treat the chest as locked. And that's the huge problem right there with perception. If you let the players roll the perception and they roll poorly, then your issue here is they're acting on, this is what we got with our poor rolls.
Yeah,
I mean, a partial solution to that, it's better when you have graded, success and failure, because that allows you to give you more or less information based on that. Because part of the problem is it's binary. Either you know it or you don't, right? Either there is a trap or there isn't a trap. There's the mechanic doesn't allow you to give you another clue. Like, okay, you got a low roll, so you didn't see a trap, but maybe you
failed,
saw that.
it's over.
Well, you saw that somebody moved the little.
And that's why Powered by the Apocalypse fascinated me, because the perception roll gives you a bonus, and the better you roll, the bigger the bonus. You could ask the question. I could go in the room, read the sitch, and say, are there any traps here? And you as the GM could say, well, there's a chest in here that is an obvious candidate for a trap, and that part of the floor is discolored. Now, that doesn't tell you that those are traps, but in game terms, now you as the player are saying, well, I get a +2 bonus to fuck with those things. So now if you're asking the question, who should open the chest, we're all going to look at you with the +2 bonus and say, you should open it because you get +2 if a trap goes off. And now it's been flipped around a little bit. Like right there, I think that's the key problem right there, is the 2-step in here. Where first I ask for information and then I act on it, rather than I think what we should be doing, which is this is the big I think this is the big divide. The way a game might have information as one step and acting on it as a separate step, when in reality you act based on the information that you got.
So I would like to go ahead and pivot completely here to a different scenario and talk about perfect versus imperfect information. And I think the best situation to look at this is in a combat, which we'll be talking about later. And in this particular scenario, I'm the player. I'm going to ask, how healthy does that character look after I've hit?
Well, it looks like someone who just took a buckler to the face. I don't know what that means to you, but
yeah, I mean, exactly. The problem with that is
because you're not going to give them back a numerical answer ever. No one does that, and I don't think anyone probably should. So you're going to inherently give back imperfect information.
Yeah, I mean, in D&D, you got hit points. You're not the unwritten rules. You're not supposed to tell the players how many hit points are left. And
but
hit
people
points
will still like to know how long it's going to take.
And hit points do not translate to amount of actual damage.
Yeah, well, I'm going to stop you all here. Okay, show of hands. Who plays a computer game? Okay, who plays a computer game where there's a health bar above your enemy's head? Okay, so when players are asking how much damage the things have, every video game for the last 20 fucking years has had health bars above the enemy's heads, and suddenly you get to D&D and D&D, we're not allowed to tell you.
Well, I also think there's an argument.
The other option for portraying that information would just be changing up the character's texture, their animation, showing bone, showing or something. That's way beyond anything anyone's ever going to do. So the health bar is a wonderful.
Well, there was a simple way to do it that they got rid of. There was D&D 4 with bloodied.
Bloodied. It's still one of my favorite terms.
That was enough to shut me the fuck up, because if you just said it was bloodied, then I knew something about the enemies that were there. But no, in modern D&D, we're not allowed. And in fact, modern D&D, I guess they still have stage bosses. From what I can tell, most bosses have legendary actions, but they can do them whenever the fuck they want.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I mean they refresh on their turn, but I want to open the cap on another bottle of this issue here, which is that
Alright.
you could make an argument that would say that while your players may not know what a nearly dead orc looks like, their characters might. Like they're role-playing characters that live in a world that understand and perceive it perfectly and have, experience with that thing.
except for one thing. One thing is, when it comes to hit points, the only hit point that matters is the last hit point.
It's the find or dead mechanic, which
I
is
agree.
which is another problem.
So
with
yeah,
D&D.
the guy could be bloodied and all that, but if he still has a big double-handed axe, it still will do 1d12 plus strength and can decapitate your character whether he has 300 hit points or just 3.
Well,
That's true, but the issue that the players have is they want to know, will this next attack be enough to end this character, or should I focus on a different... Like,
right.
it's taken for granted that they're still going to be combat effective until they're dead. They want to know how quickly they can get there.
And D&D 4 had some slight wiggle room, because there'd be some players I have additional effects I can do only on bloody opponents. Some opponents would act differently if they were bloody than if they were regular. They were those
Themselves could have
simple...
things.
But getting back to the larger problem here, it's the paradox. Like, for example, we're constantly telling players, no, don't just roll dice. Describe what you're doing. Make us all feel involved and be an actor. And like players, okay, I stabbed him. What happened? He took some hit point. It's like, you can't do that. That's like you're sending a mixed message of you're supposed to describe. But on the other hand, we're always, some people are obsessed with the turns need to go faster because it's D&D and it's a big churn. Right. I mean, like that's a huge problem right there of, not communicating stuff. But then again, I'm a big advocate of playing games like Vampire or Ironclaw that actually describe and have effects happening to people.
Now here's another one, also combat related. Do you know where every enemy is in the room?
Okay, now we're talking about where I do think perception
Now we're
checks
talking
belong,
about
which is
chessboard.
combat. Yeah,
Do
chessboard.
you
But
know where every enemy is in the room? And if one of them goes invisible, do you still know where they are, even if you are consequentially going through rules that apply to that?
I have struggled with this because it's where a lot of weirdness happens. But I know
I will
that 5e...
guarantee everyone has struggled with this rule, and there is no consensus on how precisely to handle it in play as it is happening.
Well, there's no consensus, but we all know
There's no
the
consensus.
right way.
There's approaches, that's the thing. But that's what I think perception checks, the skill check belong in combat, because I think that's an area where, it costs an action to hide or to turn invisible, then,
But let's
on
say
an
you
individual
hide.
basis.
If a character hides behind the barrel, do you remove the token from the board?
Okay, so this came up in Vital Hearts, which we're still working on, everybody. It's going to come out pretty soon. So in Vital Hearts, which is very MMO based and is also supposed to be like one guy fighting a bunch, there's a lot of enemies and players that become hidden, not just from specifically hiding, but you can also just become hidden from a special ability, or like spells can do it, where I hit you and then jump to a hide. You be a ninja and just hide. And we were asking, how do we handle that? And the way the game handles it is, if a character is hidden, they cannot be targeted by anyone else. And so you can't, if a character is hidden, no one sees them. Then we add another rule to that you can have characters who are specifically looking for hidden stuff. You can have Overwatch, and Overwatch is where it's our version of the ready action. I'm going to stop and attack when someone gets close. But anyone who's on Overwatch can make perception rolls for free. And as part of their perception rolls, the way the quality they roll, they can point at other hidden characters and reveal them. Now, I realize this is a compromise of saying, that guy runs behind that rock and hides. Well, I saw him do it, so I point him over there and say, he's hiding, remove his hidden status. All of my allies know where he is now and can hit him. Because that makes the simplifying assumption that you all work together and you shout, there he is, get him!
Yeah, and that's a good way of mechanically defining it, where there's a status and there's consequences, and
There
it's
is a
not just
consequence.
you don't know what's happening anymore.
But you even might specifically want someone specifically on Overwatch duty, which is, their only job is to spot hidden opponents.
It's still information on the board. You know they're there. You know they're hiding. But I could always see a player going, well, that NPC is hiding. We're going to go surround him while he's hiding, and even if we can't see him, as soon as he pops up, we're already surrounding him.
Which is totally
That is
valid.
an awkward bit of information.
Well, I don't see why that's awkward. If that's their hiding spot, then we would go there and try to massacre them.
Right, but of course the the informal implication of hiding is that if you are successfully hidden, people don't know you're there.
That's
Is
where I take
usually
it.
the implication, and I think when I've played D&D, that's usually the sort of argument that happens.
See, this is where I have to take you to task on this, because it's like if someone is hidden, they didn't necessarily teleport somewhere. When
Mhm.
someone goes to hide, they are moving half their movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
So I know that even though he might not be there anymore, he's not more than 15 feet away from where he was. And the second thing I know is if he ended his movement in line of sight, then he wouldn't be hidden, because the rules also say that you have to have some sort of concealment. So I know he's within 15 feet of me and behind something.
Right.
So by then I can eliminate, the things that he's buying. Now you could go old school miniatures on this. You could use decoy miniatures, which no one does anymore. Which is you could put down 2 or 3 figures on the table and say he could be in any one of these 3 spots, which is how you would do it there. But that's why we reinforce he can't be anywhere. In fact, this is one of the things that's why I brought up that's annoying about perception. Known unknowns. I know he can't be in any of the squares in line of sight of me. And I know he can't be in line of sight of any of my friends, because they would say he's right there. So he can only be in certain spots on the battlefield, and that's where he is.
Yeah. And deductive reasoning is always going to be in play there.
And
I think if I were to go ahead and put a term to it, it would be the inverse of it, the unknown known. He's hiding, I don't know where he is, but I'm over here anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's the weird part.
I've had to meet invisible monsters before. It's like, it's annoying, but
it is annoying.
Also, I think
the argument is
coming at it is from, and this is an assumption based on the rules, of course, but maybe something that shouldn't be, that we have perfect perception all the time. When something's on the board, it's just we know everything about it, and we see everything about it, and we have 360-degree vision. And like, for example, that situation, okay, somebody can't hide behind a barrel, but what if they climb, up the wall and you're looking down, right? And that gets into
standing behind you.
Yeah, or something, right? Or there's a confusion of battle. There's the battle. You're getting, people are swinging swords and casting spells. Yeah, your party is going to help you out, but they're also dodging out of the explosions and parrying attacks.
All of your friends are wearing uniforms, right? And you can immediately distinguish that from the enemy uniforms, right?
And I know the rules say you have perfect vision of the battlefield.
Well, see, this is where I have to. I mean, I agree. Like you're evoking an excuse that was in D&D Second Edition, because this is where you're saying your friends are busy, and I have to repeat, they might not be. We might even have one friend who's specifically on Overwatch duty, because we might have a healer in the party who's standing in the back and doing nothing but watching. And because they're waiting for someone to go down so they can heal them.
Because the rules assume that there's perfect perception. Once everything gets revealed, is perfectly perceived and tracked at every moment. You would never have somebody like that. So as a GM, I can't say, well, you lost them in the dinner battles. No, I can't. I see him. I saw him a moment ago. I can always see him unless
you almost unless you have the most disorganized party ever, which, let's be fair, most of you do. You would have specifically one guy whose only job it is to wait for someone to go down and then buff them or heal them. And God forbid you have any henchmen or hirelings. I know modern D&D hates that, but old school D&D, we'd have one guy whose only job it is to hold the torch. So, and it's also, and also, like, you could say, what if he runs up a wall? And I would say, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. The ceiling is 10 feet. So, moving on from there, that's once again gets into the problem of the action is different from the perception. Because one way to solve that would be to just say, well, I can't see them, but I'll make a roll to hit them anyway at a huge fucking penalty, because they can only be in so many places. The wildfire rule that some games have, like I know Shadowrun has that. And, if I roll really, really good, I can hit something. Once again, it's this weird thing where hitting things in a game is a physical ability, but perceiving things is a mental ability, when in actuality, combat is both perception and physical. And even a lot of combat is hitting things you can't even see. So it's that weird divorce going on of where the hidden status is treated differently.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm,
But
I'm,
I
with- I'm
want
with
I
you there.
wanted to go back before we because we have a couple of minutes.
Go
I want to go back to the very beginning because I think, and this is more like a tip to GMs, is that we think of perception as being primarily and not exclusively visual. And I think we can use perception in many more ways, particularly, and this is something that authors are taught. Like, it's like, hey, listen, don't just describe something visually, also go through the senses, right? What you hear, what you smell,
I
what
publish
you
Iron
feel.
Claw. Like
Yeah.
the smell comes up a lot.
Yeah, I know that because creatures have that ability. And the more of a creature that they are, they can be more smelly, I suppose. Smell better.
You can also have. I mean, there's also they perceive in different ways. Many,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
just bats, but many creatures can echolocate to varying degrees. And
But
birds and some mammals are very sensitive to air pressure, so they can sense like size, distance, and walls and floors and ceilings based totally on the wind.
Yeah, and then a game
And
like Mutants and Mastermind, you can explicitly define completely creative, brand new senses to use.
but most systems don't apply that when it comes to perception, and therefore many GMs fall on and even players. And we think also of GMs as players on only the visual, right? And I think a good way to introduce ideas and concepts to the players, if we're talking about perception as the primary way you give information to the players, is to say before you see anything, you hear dripping water or you smell something rotten, right?
Okay,
And
yeah. Can I jump on one of my favorite things? This keeps happening.
uh-huh.
The gasoline-soaked alleyway. I've heard
The
stories of this
safest
happening
alleyway.
in multiple campaigns, especially vampire ones. They remember vampires, the guys who also have enhanced senses? Where there's
Mhm.
been more than one case where the players stumble into an alleyway and find out it's been soaked with enough gasoline that it can be lit on fire. How in a million years would you not smell that?
Yeah.
And,
On the other hand, I think there should be a way of saying, okay, if a player is being, I don't know, use the term from D&D, reckless, right? Then they are sacrificing their perception for immediate action, right?
now,
Saying,
see,
I don't care what I see, I'm just going to go and do something.
and there's
I'm
a
gonna
problem.
ignore
So,
everything.
I would agree with you. If the player is reckless, they're sacrificing their perception. I agree. Counter challenge. What role playing game actually has that?
They should have. That's a good idea.
Well,
I
I
don't know
mean,
why.
they got rid of it in D&D. D&D used to have, yeah, Brad, you might as well laugh. D&D used to have a hustle rule in the game where if you moved at extra speed, you were considered flat-footed and thus were more
Mhm.
likely to be surprised or ambushed. They pointedly removed that in D&D 5.
They changed it
Yeah,
to
'cause
running, and some of them change every edition.
They
So
don't
well,
actually have,
I think
they don't actually
everybody.
have
The
it in
thing with
D&D.
Flatfoot, is that everybody forgot about Flatfooted. I never experienced like, oh,
It's not
yo,
that they forgot about it. It's that it was problematic. The problem is,
yeah,
in general, I always talk about carrots, not sticks. Generally, when you're writing a rule, you don't want to have a rule that has a stick attached to it. Like you can do this, but something bad happens to you is a bad rule because players will say, I do this, and then they'll forget that something bad happened to them. And that sets them up to fail. And it's usually a good idea in the rules to get rid of sticks whenever possible. I think I can understand why D&D got rid of the hustle rule. Instead, you can just double move, which is just use your action to move. But that you're just as perceptive when you double move as when you do anything else, like disengage or even just stand there. It doesn't change your ability. So like the flip side of this is Dungeons and Dragons assumes you're always vigilant. You can't voluntarily lower your perception in D&D in any way. There's no reckless move. There's no attack for a +2 to hit, but penalty your armor class. There's the opposite of that, where you can attack with a penalty to hit and a bonus to your armor class. You can't deliberately be less vigilant in D&D. So, the idea of saying the player was being reckless, I could say if the player was being reckless, we punish them for it. But there's no concept of that in many role-playing games.
yeah.
Now that said, like in the Iron Claw game, the games we make, and we got particular, we do have the rule called focus in the game, which is if somebody stops, like you say, I'm going to stop attacking. This is what you brought up. It was like, well, if I'm too busy in the fight, I can't notice something. Well, in our games, we built in the focus rule, which is, okay, if you stop doing shit, like just stop attacking, we'll give you a buff in the game called focus. While you're focused, no one can sneak up on you because you're focused. You're doing the exact thing we talked about. And we also built that in the game because if you had nothing to do, like it's exactly what you were talking about. You know, what if I wasn't reckless? And I've noticed that when we're gaming with Red, like this is a paradigm shift because in like Ironclaw, you're rewarded for moving slowly and guarding, but you have to do that consciously. You have to choose in the game to, I'm going to raise my defenses and move more slowly. Because like I've noticed that when people play Ironclaw, because that's not a concept, they just rush right into the fight. And since Ironclaw was built around the idea of being reckless, players get killed. And then I read all the reviews saying like, oh, we rushed right into combat and then we all died. I don't understand. And it was like, well, I can't blame the players for that. No role-playing game rewards you for being cautious. Except maybe Ironclaw. And then I have to get out of Ironclaw because everyone's done.
Ironclaw. But I'm telling you, man, it's examples of play. I think would go miles and miles. I know you don't like them, but
I think you're right. But also, it's like I've seen too much of it. I mean, like I said, does anyone run D&D in such a way that somehow you're rewarded for more cautious play?
I mean, in
I've
this
seen it in
specific
Vampire. Like I was just talking about the gasoline-soaked alleyway. I've seen people run into the gasoline-soaked alleyway. Why would you do this?
The problem is that there is. I feel like this is something that you always run into when you're a really new game master and you haven't like poured over all of the rules with a fine-tooth comb, and there becomes this like formalization that you and your friends discover as you play, and that is specifically the, oh, of course I had my weapon out. Why would I be walking through this creepy dungeon without my sword drawn? And the, oh, of course I was moving quietly, and yet. Also, in some groups, it's like, oh, we hear a noise, I ready my weapon, because it seems like, you know, the response, right? Implying that you don't already have your weapon readied, but of course in that game, readying a weapon is part of your move action. It's kind of like a freebie. So, like, I think that there becomes a formalization for all of these edge cases that we don't really know how to narratively deliver, and perception is a big part of this, where, you know, we're not narrating second by second, moment by moment, what everyone is doing as they move from this side of the room to this other side of the room. But because of that, there's certain assumptions that we have to make, and where are we going to fall on those assumptions? Are you looking above you while you walk through the room? Do you have your weapon out?
Well, let's throw into this the game Fate, because people like to talk about Fate being a good game. And it's got the idea in it of aspects, which is the idea that when you first walk into the room or situation, the game master is supposed to describe it to you. You are in a cold, dank cave with lots of rubble, or you are in a speakeasy with lots of smoke and partying people. And then, in theory, during the game, you can invoke the aspects to help tell the story. Like if I wanted to escape in the cave, I could say, well, you told me the cave was dark, so I'll hide in the darkness. Or the speakeasy is full of partygoers, I'll spend an aspect to mingle with the crowd. And the idea that you can invoke more details about what's in the room and the placement and all of that by using aspects. And this plays into perception because it means you could, the mere act of showing up in the room, improv or invoke things that weren't described to you. And I need to point out, like, that's the players are being allowed to describe details that are in the room. Previous to all of this, we only said that the game master was allowed to describe what's in the scene and define all of that. If the player are allowed to embellish on the story and put things into the situation, these are things that weren't perceived before. These are things that just poofed out of imagination. Mm-hmm. So if players are allowed to do that, then I mean, I'm just like pointing out here, like this isn't, we didn't have to make perception rolls for this kind of stuff. I mean, in Fate, you spend aspect points. But like if the players are allowed to improv details that weren't there before, then I think like building on the meta of this, it's kind of like saying like the perception should be to tell people what's in the room so they can work with what they know. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to punish people for not knowing what's in the room, that's when it's going to get all ugly and mechanical on you, because the players want to exert influence on the story.
Of course.
Right, yeah. Once you start dealing with everyone adding details to it, everyone technically has perfect information, because you can't, as a player, know that it's there until someone invents it.
I'm not sure what this means, but I've seen it done, and it's like a weird short-circuiting where I've seen GMs ask for perception rolls, and then the success or failure of that roll determines whether or not there was a trap or treasure where they were looking, right?
Well,
They
yeah,
use
no,
that
I
as a
mean,
way to generate reality.
See, that's one of the well, you're playing Forbidden Lands, and Forbidden Lands, the mere act of failing a scouting roll invokes enemies to come eat your face.
That's very true. Mechanically
So,
speaking, yes.
right. I mean, like that. That's like, yeah, that's what came up in the Power by the Apocalypse games that we write. We prefer to use events. We prefer to use the theory that.
Sorry, I gotta interrupt here. So, because yeah, Theta's pointing out it's the scouting roll does not generate an event. It simply makes you aware of the event or not. But
Okay.
there are tables where if you fail on like your camp preparation, bad things happen, and some of those bad things, I don't know exactly.
Okay,
I have
so
to check
it's
the
like the
tables.
camping rolls, right? But I mean,
Yeah.
but like, the Forbidden Lands has fumbles in it. Any game that has fumbles in it has the concept that I fumbled my roll and stumbled across a hornet's nest. Did the hornet's nest exist because I fumbled my roll, or was I perceptive enough to wander around it? And,
Right.
Yeah, and so what I was getting at was I used to play games like Rollmaster, and we put that stuff into our Powered by the Apocalypse games, which is if you roll doubles on a roll, something weird happens. And that was specifically meant to divorce the randomness of the event from your skill. Because but getting back to what we were discussing, there are some games that have the possibility that if you rolled badly, something terrible happened to you. And even though the narrative would be you blundered into it because you didn't see it, or you were too an expert to deal with it, mechanically it happened to you because you rolled shitty. And
Yeah.
so
Which is an expression of your character stats.
Right. And so that is the question of if we're running the story, that's part of the problem of running the simulation versus running the narrative. Perception implies there is a perfect world that could be observed, and everything was there. And all you had to do was roll high enough in your perception to perceive it and see it, and get involved with it, which is the opposite of like, technically as a GM, you can improv things. We keep talking about, well, what if you just added more goblins to the fight to make it more, difficult or more challenging? Well, yeah. Well, if you could change the universe, then, anything could be in this room, until, just by perceiving it. I could just say, and suddenly the wall collapses and 3 minotaurs come in. I can do that at any time. So that's kind of the problem with the perception, being that the players are going to cling to that because they want to know what's going to happen. And I really think that's the mentality. That's the problem with the mentality behind it. We shouldn't be looking at perception as a way of there's one true world and we have to observe it. I think we'd be a lot better off if this is the situation we've presented, and if you roll well, you'll find ways to use it to your advantage. And if you roll poorly, the situation will turn to your disadvantage.
Yeah, I think so, right? I think that's probably the best compromise between a simulationist world and a world where everything is being invented on the spot. Is this idea that like some of these things have been predetermined, but reality is slightly fungible based on how the character's actions and the character's roles. The roles, it's a little bit of a cheat, maybe like physically, but narratively, I think it works very well.
Right, and I want to wrap all this up because it's about time I think we concluded by saying that I think it's dangerous. Like really, we have to emphasize this is we shouldn't be telling players that they have to specifically tell you they're vigilant. We opened all of this by the players saying, "Well, I look at it, but I don't look at it." To like try not to set it off or something like that, because players are vigilant. I would always take the carrot approach, and you should be assuming the players are constantly vigilant. The rules even say that. D&D 1 says it takes an hour to walk 120 feet. Dude, if you're taking an hour to walk 120 feet, I don't see you can be more vigilant than that. So, players are seasoned veterans even at level 1. I'm not taking if you want to play a comedy game, that's up to you. They are constantly like looking out for their own survival and constantly perceiving things. So we should work with them and take the blanket assumption that they are vigilant for this. And we already talked about like other things. We should find ways to build on that. And so I want to move away from perception and more towards, like we saw in Forbidden Lands. It's like, look, bad things happen. The mere act of using a skill or exerting influence on the game assumes you can also perceive it. And so we should get away from perception as an idea and closer to exerting influence on the world. And part of that implies that you perceive.
I agree.
You got anything to add to that, Red?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that for me, I personally want to encourage people away from leaning on perception and perception adjacent skills as their only way to interact. And I think that goes back to my idea of like, starting the game as a discussion, and if your players, ask about the world, you tell them about the world, they ask more about the world. And it's only when you're in a position where you need to determine who can see the rogue hiding in the bush to hit them with a ranged attack that you should be leaning on things like perception. So that's where I'm currently at, and that might change because my attitude towards these things change as I play the games more. But yeah, I'm currently in like a trying to minimize perception rolls state of mind.
All right, Lessons, and what's your final word on all this?
I'm still on the air. I think it's still useful, but it has to be seen more than as a tool of preventing the players from not knowing things, and it should be more of a tool of what you're actually giving them, so they can actually play the game and interact better with it, with the environment, rather than being a penalty of no, you didn't see this, so suffer.
Right. Alrighty then. So, I think that's going to be it for today's episode of Notes from the Aleph. We stream episodes bi-weekly Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can come join us live at twitch.tv at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel. You can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join us on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Quarrels Ironclaw expansion book. Don't forget to check out Red Rabbit and Book 'em for a Game over on startplaying.games as Red Rabbit, and don't forget to check out Lessons Learned at the Lessons Learned one on YouTube and Twitch, and check out his Amazon for all of his wonderful books as well. And of course, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again. Until next time, everybody.
There's the wave.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Wave. Woo.
I do
Peer
need to
pressure.
take another short break.
Okay. Short
I'll be
break.
right back.
I'm gonna get a drink. See you in a bit.